So, now that we understand the basics of what the United Nations is and why it exists and how we might simulate it, it's time to put a disclaimer on that. In this hobby that we call Model UN, we don't always simulate the United Nations, because if you're part of one of these UN student clubs or an international relations student clubs, you probably have a broad interest in politics and international affairs. So we might simulate some other types of committee as well. One of these types is obviously simulating the UN, and that's what we're going to focus on in this series. A second type of committee, however, is simulating a different international body, but still in a very formal way. So you might be allocated a position in the World Health Organization, or NATO, or the International Atomic Energy Agency, one of those bodies like that. And a third type of committee is a crisis, where you'll again be part of an international body, typically a government or a military, but world events will actually change as you go through the committee. Now, we can simplify this a little bit because we tend to treat the first two types of committee, the UN bodies and the international bodies, but done in a formal way, very, very similarly for the sake of convenience. So if you're simulating the UN body, you'll have rules of procedure, which we'll cover in this series, and you'll typically publish a document at the end called a resolution. You don't have to, but most people typically will try to. If you are in NATO, for instance, simulating one of those international organizations, even though you would have different rules of procedure in real life, we tend to use the same old Model UN ones for convenience, and you'll typically publish a different document at the end. It might be called a treaty or a statement or a trade agreement or something different depending on what the organization is and what makes sense, but they will behave very, very similarly. So if you do a Model UN committee or a NATO committee or something like that, they will prepare you for one another, and they're both quite similar. Crisis committees are very, very different. When you go into a crisis, you'll be allocated an individual, typically with a name and character and history. You'll have specific resources under your command, such as a certain number of soldiers to command. You'll be able to submit what's called an order or a directive in most countries to the director of the committee. So you'll say, I send my soldiers 300 meters to the west, and they will use some system, typically a spreadsheet with some element of calculation and some element of chance, to determine what happens. So they'll get back to you and they'll say, your soldiers have moved 300 meters to the west, but one of them was shot and killed in the process. And you'll go back and forth, and everyone will have their own ideas, and you'll simulate an actual unfolding crisis that way. Now, as you might expect from the very different format, these two activities also have very different cultures. So if you're simulating the UN or an international body, there will be a strong focus on diplomacy and debate and public speaking and research and fact, and really trying to figure out practical solutions that might actually make the world a better place. In crisis, there's typically a culture, and this depends on what your local Model UN scene is like, but there's typically a culture of fun and escalation and intrigue and plots, and treating it like you're watching Game of Thrones or playing a video game. Some people love one or the other, some people love both, and that's something that you will discover over your time in Model UN. But if you are starting out in Model UN and you're just trying to get the hang of things first, I would strongly recommend starting with a specific simulation of the United Nations, and particularly a General Assembly Committee. And the reason for that is, one, it's probably closer to what you expect when you sign up for Model UN, and two, not only does Model UN have a higher skill ceiling, because there's never an element of randomness involved, unlike in the crisis spreadsheets, but there's also a lower skill floor. So what I mean by that is, most committees, you won't have to do a single thing except maybe one speech over the course of the entire conference in order to participate sensibly in the committee. You could literally just sit there and be completely compliant with all the rules and procedures. Whereas in a crisis, there's a lot more expected of you by default just to exist in the committee. You could technically do nothing, but it would start to actively undermine things, and that's not so good for your first experience. So if you're unsure, and if you want diplomacy and debate and learning to be a really good negotiator, start with a specific Model UN committee, and then branch out later once you've got your bearings.